Okay. So just our agenda for today, I'll talk a little bit about myself, about how I ended up here. I'll give an introduction to the Bureau of Land Management and Dominguez-Escalante National Conservation Area. And just a note, these acronyms are really commonly used, and so I'll be using these acronyms BLM and DENCA throughout the presentation. Then I will talk about my project, how it was developed, the goals that I had for myself, and then the interview questions that I used. I'll talk about the findings and recommendations that I came up with, and then challenges and limitations, and finally I'll end with a self-reflection about myself throughout this process. So I was born and raised in Orlando, Florida. I went to the University of Florida and graduated in 2018 with a bachelor's degree in biology and a minor in sustainability studies. After I graduated, I went to Europe for 3 months by myself, where I worked on a farm in Switzerland for about a month of that time. This was a small-scale vegetable farm where I learned about the connection of community and food, and that really inspired me to try to work on other farms. And so in 2019, I moved to Basalt, Colorado, where I worked at a farm called Rock Bottom Ranch, which is a part of the Aspen Center for Environmental Studies. And here I learned more about larger scale regenerative agriculture, including vegetable farming and livestock. And I was able to further that connection between food and people and nature and food. So that's what brought me here to CLTL. And now a little introduction to the Bureau of Land Management, BLM for short. The BLM is a common term out west for a federal land management agency. They manage about 8.3 million acres of public land in Colorado. This land is used for livestock grazing, mining, and other extractive uses and recreation. And the BLM's mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So I was specifically working in a national conservation area, and national conservation areas are a subsection of the Bureau of Land Management. So they're managed by the BLM, but they are managed specifically for conservation. So there's no extractive uses or things like that allowed. The NCA's mission is to conserve, protect, enhance, and manage the public lands for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. So kind of similar mission statements, just more specifically for conservation. A cool thing about NCAs is that they have to be approved by Congress, and so they're voted on. This is a little bit different than things like, say, a national monument that is just a presidential proclamation. So the next president could overturn that really easily. These have a little bit more permanent protections. And then in Colorado, we have 3 NCAs. I was working in the Dominguez-Escalante National Conservation Area. And we actually have a potential 4th one on its way. It's being discussed in Congress right now, so that's pretty cool. And then just a little introduction to my project partners at the BLM. They were based in the Grand Junction field office. Their names are Dan Van Horen, Daniel Gorley, Amber Koski, and Zachary Kelly. And they were there to help me develop the project and answer any questions that I had throughout the process. So a little bit of an overview of the DENCA. It is located outside of Grand Junction, Colorado, and it's managed by the Grand Junction BLM field office. It was designated by Congress in 2009 through the Omnibus Act. It's over 200,000 acres, so that's really big. And then within that 200,000 acres, there's 66,000 acres that are considered wilderness area. So that just means it's even more conserved. There are no motorized uses allowed and other things like that. There's certain restrictions in the wilderness area. The elevation can range from 4,800 feet to 8,200 feet. And within the canyons, the bottom to the top of the canyon can be anywhere from like up to 3,000 feet in elevation difference. So it's a pretty impressive sight when you're there. And then finally, they have over 115 miles of streams and rivers, and 30 of those miles are the Gunnison River, which flows right into Colorado, and as we all know, is a really important source of water for the West. So I just want to orient ourselves here. This is a map of DENCA, and that white box up top is Colorado. And so I can't reach, but we're in Fort Collins up at the top there. And DENCA is really close to the border of Utah, south of Grand Junction, Colorado. And then if we look at this zoomed in map here, This darker orange part is that wilderness area that I was talking about. All right, so I want to talk about the ecosystem and habitat types of DENCA. Southwest Colorado is known as canyon country, and this is because there are a lot of canyons there. DENCA is on the Colorado Plateau, which crosses over 4 states, and that just means it's a really big basin that has mesas that spring up from it, so that's where you get those canyons. There are 2 main canyons in DENCA. They are called the Dominguez Canyon and the Escalante Canyon, so they got really creative with their naming there. There are also a bunch of other smaller canyons within the area, including Uniweep and the Little Dominguez Canyon. DENCA is considered a semi-arid high desert, and this just means they get about 10 to 20 inches of precipitation a year and are over 2,000 feet in elevation. Temperatures can range from, in the winter, the highs are in the 40s, and in the summer, the highs can be over 100 degrees. And I will talk about that a little bit more later because, as we know, my project took place in the summer, and so I had to be a little flexible with things. And then finally, about the habitat types, there are 7 different habitat types within that 200,000 acre national conservation area. And I won't go into detail on all of these, but if you guys are interested, I highly recommend looking at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program's website. They do a really good job of describing all of these habitat types with pictures and descriptions of the animals and plants that live there. I did spend most of my time in the desert shrub, the sagebrush, shrublands, and the riparian areas. Okay, so on to some plants and animals that exist in this area. Of course, there are a lot more than I'm able to cover, but I just want to talk about 2 species in particular. These are kind of the species that when you think about DENCA, these are the 2 that pop into your mind. So the first one is the desert bighorn sheep, and there are about 500 individuals in Colorado. I think I might have seen every single one of them while I was interviewing people. This is my picture, and it was just so exciting to see them. I saw huge herds every single day that I was there. It was pretty magical, and it's really cool because they hop between canyons, so they go up and over, and I saw them every single time when they could have been in any canyon. So I thought that was really cool. And then some other animals that live there are peregrine falcons, collared lizards, turkeys, mountain lions, black bears, deer, elk, all your usual things. And now on to the plant species that's most recognizable. DENCA has what they consider sensitive plants. They have about 40 of these. This just means that they're really fragile and can be affected drastically by small changes in the system. So they're not listed as threatened or endangered at the moment, but they could be if there's a really big drought or a huge increase in temperature, things like that. And this is the Colorado hookless cactus. It is a rare and endemic plant, so that means that it is only found in DENCA in the entire world. That's the only place that it lives. It's really small, so in this picture, it's about the size of a grape. And when it's not flowering, so when it doesn't have those beautiful pink flowers, it turns gray and blends in with its surroundings, which means it's very hard to see, and people can trample on it by going off trail or camping in non-designated areas. And then some other plants that are in this area are the desert sagebrush, mountain mahogany, juniper, and prickly pear cactus. Okay, so some social dimensions of the area. There are a variety of recreation activities that you can do in this area. The most popular are boating, camping, and hiking. There are 2 established campgrounds in DENCA, and then there's dispersed camping on the roads along to those campgrounds. So that just means the established campgrounds generally have amenities like a bathroom, a picnic table, a shade structure, which is really important in this area. And then the dispersed camping is more secluded and it doesn't have those amenities. There is also camping along the river corridor, so people who want to go out on a boating trip for 1 or 2 nights can camp along the river. And with my project, I targeted all 3 of those locations. So I talked to people who are camping in a tent at the designated campgrounds, at the dispersed campgrounds, and then people who are going out onto the river for an overnight trip. And then one cool thing I want to talk about the governance structure of DENCA, they have what they call the Resource Advisory Council. And this is basically a board of stakeholder representatives. So they have some boaters, some rock climbers, some hunters, all on this board, and they represent their stakeholder group. They are important because anytime the BLM wants to change policy or implement some sort of decision, the Resource Advisory Council has to vote on it. And so they give a lot of feedback and will vote on their final draft. All right, so now I want to talk about the need for the project, how my BLM partners and I decided to go about interviewing campers about a hypothetical fee for camping. The biggest thing that we talked about was just this increase in visitation to public lands that we've seen in the last few years across the entire Western United States, but specifically in Colorado. And this was only exacerbated by COVID. So as COVID happened, people wanted to get outside more, get away from the big cities and into these natural spaces. And of course, with this increased visitation, that leads to increased human impact. Another reason that visitation has increased is because of the national park permitting systems. So like the timed entry that they have implemented since COVID. As I mentioned, DENCA is really close to the border of Utah. There's like 5 national parks in Utah that are also close to the border of Colorado. And then there's a few national parks in Colorado. So when people weren't able to get into those national parks, they went somewhere else. And that happened to be DENCA because it was close by. So here are some numbers from the BLM field office. From 2017 to 2022, they have been tracking their visitation, and they've seen a 40% increase in the number of people that are visiting. So that's pretty significant. And then another thing we talked about that brought us to this project was that user fees have become a common solution to this increased visitation. User fees are any collection of money in exchange for use of the land or services on the land. So this can include things like parking fees, entrance fees, camping fees, much more. User fees generally provide a better user experience and can go towards conservation and protection of that land. So my project was specifically looking at user fees for camping. And this is because camping in DENCA has traditionally been free and is pretty unregulated. So no one's out there monitoring if people are camping in designated spots or making their own or things like that. And when people make their own spots, this can have impacts on the ecosystem, and it can have unintended safety risks for humans as well. So with all of this, we decided to interview visitors about their perceptions of a hypothetical camping fee. So that brings me to my goal. My goal was to understand recreationists' perceptions of a hypothetical fee for camping within DENCA while gathering visitor demographic data. And I just want to make a note here about the word hypothetical, it being really important in this project, and you've probably noticed I've said it a lot already. The BLM and I decided that we should use the word hypothetical because of that strict process they have to go through to change policy. So with the Resource Advisory Council, you know, they have to approve all these things. And we didn't want to scare people being like, this will be paid for in a year, right? Like I can't say that. So it's like, I wanted to make sure everyone knew this was hypothetical, nothing's happening. We're just getting your input, trying to figure out if this is something that could be, or if we should not do this at all, things like that. So the word hypothetical is very important when I was talking to people. So my objectives included collecting demographic data of the visitors. So this included things like their zip code, their primary recreation activity, household income, race, and gender. My second objective was to hear visitors' perceptions of hypothetical fees for camping, along with their willingness to pay. And then my third objective was to compare recreationist perceptions based on demographics. So I kind of combined those first two objectives into a third. So my timeline, it did not look like this before I started my project. I had to be super flexible in working on this project. I was kind of racing the heat, so it got to over 100 degrees while I was there, and so I kind of had to adapt as we went. So in the beginning of June, I developed my interviews, and then I started the interviews by the end of June. In July, I conducted 35 in-person interviews, and by the end of July, I was sitting in the desert with no shade, and it was 110 degrees. So no one, of course, was out there. I couldn't interview anybody. So at that point, I decided I should move my interviews online. I thought it would be an important aspect to capture by emailing businesses and organizations that are local to Grand Junction to kind of get their perception of the hypothetical fees. And I thought this was important because there is some scientific literature that shows that gateway communities, so communities that are neighboring federal lands, can actually be negatively impacted by increase in user fees. And so I thought that gathering their perceptions would be important as well. So finally, in September and October, I did all my data analysis and I wrote my report, and my deliverables for the BLM were a 43-page report and an executive summary. Okay, so I created a semi-structured informal interview that was done in person, and I adapted this from Braun and Clark's value elicitation method. So I really wanted to make this interaction super short, super informal, and this was because I didn't want to impede on people's relaxation and recreation time. I was approaching people at their campsite or while they were trying to get on the water and go boating. So I really wanted to make sure that I kept this short, and if they wanted to talk to me longer, they could. I only approached people who were actively camping or who were getting on the river with all their camping gear. And if it was unclear whether or not they were camping, I would ask them first before I bothered them with the rest of the interview. So because of the semi-structured nature of this interview, they lasted anywhere from 3 minutes if someone was like, fine, I'll talk to you, or up to 30 minutes if someone had a lot to say and felt really passionate about it. So the interview questions that I ended up using were, what would be some advantages to a fee system or paying to camp in DENCA? What would be some disadvantages to a fee system? How much would you be willing to pay to camp within DENCA? And do you have anything else that you want to share with me? So just those 4 basic questions. And then to get my demographic information, I created a really short survey that I handed out once we were done speaking. And this was optional. Most people said they would fill it out. Some people did opt out of it. And some people opted out of certain questions. So, but for the most part, people answered all of them and were more than happy to fill it out for me. I did create an online version of the interview questions and this survey that I had a QR code of in case someone was like, oh, we don't have time. I could hand it to them and be like, oh, fill it out when you get back in service, or, you know, if they wanted to. But I ended up not even needing those because I approached 36 people and 35 people said yes. So I had a 97% response rate, which I was really proud of. Okay, so I just want to take us back to the map real quick to show you where I was stationed. The 2 established campgrounds are the Potholes Campground and the Big Dominguez Campground over there. I spent most of my time at the Potholes Campground. I was actually camping while I was there. So that was fun to kind of be in the zone. And then this is the boat put in. So it was about a 20-minute drive. I would get there at like 6 a.m. and just try to catch as many people as I could as they were heading out onto the water for the weekend. And then I interviewed people that I was camping right next door to. And then on the weekend of the 4th of July, I went up to the Big Dominguez campground where I got a few more people. So I had about a total of 8 days of in-person interviews, and that's where I was able to talk to 35 people. Okay, so on to my data. This is my demographic data that I'm about to show you, and I want to just explain something real quick. So I had 35 in-person interviews, and I got 5 interviews from those businesses and organizations. The demographic data only represents the 35 interviews of in-person interviews because the survey was more geared towards individuals as opposed to someone representing a business or organization. So this is only the 35 in-person interviews. So I asked people their primary recreation activity. 27% of the people that I talked to identified that they were there for camping. That was their main reason for being in DENCA. And then 57% of the people that I talked to said that boating and camping were their main reason for being there. And then the other 15% were also camping, but their main reason for being there was either fishing or ATVing. So I just kind of clumped those together because it was such a small percentage. And then 69% of the people that I interviewed identified themselves as men, and 30% of the people I interviewed identified themselves as women. I did have a non-binary and an other option available on the survey, but no one selected that. And this is true for all of my data, but because I was only able to interview 35 people, I think that it's not necessarily representative of who's actually visiting DENCA. So that doesn't mean there aren't non-binary people visiting, or there are only 30% of women that are visiting. So my numbers are just who I talk to and not representative of the whole. Okay, so when I asked people their zip code, I found that 73% of people were from Colorado, and then 72% of those people were from the western slope of Colorado. So the western slope is the western half of the state. It's on the west side of the Continental Divide. And then I asked people their income, and I found that 60% of the people that I talked to make under $90,000 a year. So finally, I asked people what race they identify as, and as we can see, it's probably not surprising, my data was not very diverse. I talked to 89% of people identified as white, and then I had one person that identified as Hispanic, and 2 people that identified as multiracial, and multiracial was either white and Hispanic or white and Asian. And so just like I just mentioned, this is not necessarily representative of who's visiting this area, but this is who I talk to. All right, so on to my themes. I think this is probably the biggest part of what I did, was analyzing these interviews that I had. And I used thematic analysis to analyze the qualitative data. So that basically means I looked at all my interviews, I highlighted keywords, and then I found commonalities between those keywords. So recurring ideas that popped up between all 40 of these interviews. So these themes do include the businesses and organizations' responses. So these themes are not necessarily people's values, but could be linked to values. And that is linked to behavior, and that could then be linked to things like their willingness to pay and their acceptance of fees. So if fees are implemented, they might be more willing to accept them based on these themes. So I came up with 6 major themes and 16 sub-themes, and I'm gonna go over all of them. I'm gonna show you all 6, and then I'll show you how I will go over them on the next few slides. So my themes were crowd management, maintenance, distrust of government, environmentalism, backup options, and reservations. So those were the major themes that I found. And then on the next few slides, I'm going to talk about them. We'll see the theme in big bold letters at the top. Then we'll have the sub-theme, a short description, perception, so whether people saw it as an advantage or a disadvantage, and then the frequency of people that brought it up to me. Okay, so our first theme is crowd management, and this included sub-themes of limits people and use and limits access. So when it was brought up to me, limits people and use was the idea that if I have to pay to camp, there are going to be less people here, which provides a better experience for me. I feel more connected to nature. I don't have to deal with crowds or young kids that are screaming in my ears, things like that. This was brought up as an advantage by 27.5% of people. And then on the other side of that coin, we have limits access, which is the inherent equity issue that arises when you have to pay to camp. So that prohibits some people from being able to go and enjoy that activity. This was brought up as a disadvantage by 47.5% of people. So this was my most brought up sub-theme. Almost half the people that I talked to brought it up, which is kind of reassuring that people are thinking about the equity issue that arises. And then just one note that will matter later, and I will remind you, but this is the only theme that has one advantage and one disadvantage as sub-themes, and that'll just be important for later, but I'll remind you. Okay, Our second theme is maintenance. This includes amenities, clean spaces, trash, cost of upkeep, and ranger presence. So this theme was by far the most broad. It had the most sub-themes. Amenities was when someone would be like, oh, hopefully there would be amenities here. They either just said the word amenities or they named a specific amenity. Most of the time they did say, hopefully there would be this here if I had to pay, right? So it's not a guarantee. But this is just the idea that when you pay to camp, you have those amenities. You should get something out of your money. And this was an advantage to 37.5% of people. Then we have clean spaces. So this is the idea that when you pay to camp, the bathrooms tend to be cleaner, or there are bathrooms, that the camping pad tends to be more maintained, so there aren't weeds growing up through it, or it's not as rocky or things like that. So this was brought up as an advantage, also by 37.5% of people. And then we have trash as a sub-theme. So this was a specific amenity that was brought up multiple times by people. And this is the idea that when you pay to camp, there are trash cans available, or people don't leave their trash all over the place and things like that. And that was considered an advantage as well of paying to camp. Then we have cost of upkeep. So this was the idea that people brought up, they understand when I'm camping here, someone has to take care of it, and that costs money, right? Someone has to be paid to clean the bathroom or to remove the trash and things like that. And so people understand that it takes money to run things like this. And so they would be willing to pay to camp for that. So that was considered an advantage by 12.5% of people. And then the last sub-theme is ranger presence. And I find this to be the most interesting sub-theme of probably all my sub-themes, but specifically of maintenance. This was only brought up by the businesses and organizations. So not a single person that I talked to in person mentioned ranger presence at all. And when it was brought up by the businesses and organizations, it was brought up as an advantage. So this is just the idea that when there are funds being collected at the campground, there's more money for rangers there, and that allows for a positive interaction between rangers and people with either education or safety measures and things like that. So 10% of everyone that I talked to brought it up, but 80% of the businesses and organizations that I talked to brought it up. So I just thought that was really interesting that they mentioned that. All right, the next theme is distrust of government. This includes taxes / public landowners and accountability and transparency. So the first sub-theme of taxes / public landowners is just the idea that federal lands manage these lands for its people and taxes go towards that purpose. Some people told me, you know, we pay taxes, I shouldn't have to pay to camp here, or I've shopped in all the stores while I've been camping here, my money's going towards the local government, so I shouldn't have to pay to camp here. So this was seen as a disadvantage by 17.5% of people. And then we have accountability and transparency. This was just people being like, where's the money going? Is my money going towards what I think it's going towards? Is it being used on local issues? Is it going to a third-party agency? Is just things like that where people are like, is it going towards conservation? I have no idea what I'm paying for. And so that was seen as a disadvantage as well by 37.5% of people. Okay, our next theme is environmentalism. So this includes conservation, stewardship, and education. And I just want to define conservation and stewardship the way people use them to me, because they can be interchangeable. They kind of seem like synonyms, but the way that people use them when talking to me was slightly different. So conservation was when people brought up what the management agency is doing to protect the land. Stewardship was brought up when people talked about what the visitors can do to protect the land. So while they seem like synonyms, they're slightly different just in the way they were used. So conservation is just when you pay fees, you hope that money can go towards preserving that area, protecting the animals and the plants. This was brought up as an advantage by 25% of people. Then stewardship, a lot of people told me when you pay for something, you take better care of it. So that's just the description is, you know, when you have to pay for it, you tend to take more care of it. That was also an advantage, and 22.5% of people brought that up. And then finally, we have education. And this was just when I pay for camping, I hope there's educational materials there, something where I can learn about the species that live in this area, or best practices of leave no trace and things like that. So just more educational material are available, and that could be helpful for new campers and old campers alike. So 12.5% of people brought that up. Okay, so the next theme is backup options. This includes spillover and keep a free option. So spillover is defined as when an activity is limited in one area. So for example, with a fee for camping, people tend to move to another area and cause that exact same harmful impact in another area. So people that I talked to didn't say, oh, this would cause spillover. They said, oh, if I had to pay to camp here, I would go somewhere else. Like I would either go make a spot on the other side of the road, or I would go out of this area. And people were actually very honest about that. They were like, yeah, I would just go set up my tent somewhere else. So this was seen as a disadvantage by 12.5% of people. And then we have keep a free option. So this was just the concern that if the BLM starts charging for camping, that all the camping would be charged, that you wouldn't be able to even go to like dispersed sites without paying, and that could limit some people's ability to go out. So this was considered a disadvantage as well by 30% of people. And then finally, the last theme is reservations. And I found this theme pretty interesting too, because as I've mentioned, I was talking about fees only, just paying to camp. And a lot of people brought up reservations as maybe like a logical next step for what the BLM would do if they do start charging. Both of these sub-themes were disadvantages to people. The first one is rec.gov. And if you don't know what rec.gov is, it's just the third-party agency that you can book all your federal land activities in. So if you want to take a tour in a national park, or if you want to camp in a national forest, you can reserve ahead of time those things. And I found that the people who do not like rec.gov really don't like rec.gov. Some of my longer conversations were people talking about rec.gov. Yeah, so they just don't like the reservation system, and I think the interface of the website. And then we have impact on locals. So this was just the idea that when reservations are implemented, locals tend to get kicked out of those spaces. So the reservations go really quickly, and locals can't go to where they love to go on the weekends, or if they get a reservation, the weather could be bad, and then they have no flexibility in that, and they're not allowed to go to these places that they've always frequently visited. And so that was a disadvantage by 17.5% of people. Okay, so now I want to talk about some comparisons of the themes based on the demographic data. So because we're looking at demographics, it's only those 35 individuals that I talked to. So I want to explain this graph, and this comes back to that first theme being having a sub-theme of an advantage and a disadvantage. I split up the graph by theme. So each theme is here, except for crowd management is split into its sub-themes, because one was an advantage, one was a disadvantage. All the other themes were either all advantages or all disadvantages. So we have the stars indicate which ones were advantages. So if we look here, I have the frequency of themes based on primary recreation activity. And as you can see, most of the people, independent of what their primary recreation activity was, prioritized maintenance as their highest priority. So they brought that up the most. Campers tied with backup options there. Okay, and then same idea, all the themes are there, advantages are starred. And this is a frequency of themes based on gender. And I think that this is a pretty interesting table, because we can see here that people who identified as men prioritized maintenance, and people who identified as women tended to prioritize the equity issues, so limits access, and environmentalism. And like I mentioned, I was only able to interview 35 people. So I would be interested to see this, if this was still a trend with with more people being interviewed. Okay, so I've talked about my demographic data, my themes, and I compared those themes. That brings me now to willingness to pay. Willingness to pay is defined as the maximum amount that someone is willing to give up in exchange for a good or service. So when I asked people what they would be willing to pay to camp, they usually gave me a range. So they said $5 to $10 or $20 to $30. And because of the definition of willingness to pay, I took their highest value and I made this graph. So these were all the values that people said they would be willing to pay. Most people said zero. Sorry, not most people, 15% of people said zero, and then 6% of people said they would pay $50. So there is a pretty wide range in what people were willing to pay. And one thing that I find interesting is that if we add the bottom 4 bars together, that's 64% of people. So 64% of people were not willing to pay more than $15. And the reason this is interesting is because the going rate in Colorado is generally $20 or more. And so it's just interesting that more than half of the people I talked to were not willing to pay more than 15. Okay, so this is the exact same data as on the last slide, but I've just condensed it to simplify it so that I can do some comparisons. So I just put them into evenly spaced ranges and simplified it into less bars for comparison purposes. So here I have comparison of the primary recreation activity and what people are willing to pay to camp. The interesting things that I find with this graph is that people who were boating and camping were the people that said they would pay more to camp. They generally had higher values. So the only people that said they would pay $50 were boaters. And then the other interesting thing that I find in this is that campers had the highest percentage of not willing to pay a single dollar to camp. So people who were just there to camp said, I do not want to pay. So they most often said that. All right, now I have a comparison of willingness to pay by household income. And here I was expecting to see a really big trend. Based on literature, we know that when you make more money, you're more willing to pay for anything in general, but specifically recreation. And my data doesn't show a trend, it's just kind of all over the place. And I think that this could have a lot to do with my small sample size. I think that if I interviewed more people, asked more people, I would probably get a more clear trend. But here I did not see that trend. All right, so my recommendations to the BLM. These recommendations were not necessarily to tell the BLM if they should or should not implement a fee for camping, but rather to guide them in coming up with some solutions or the next steps if they do want to move forward with that. I took the most significant concerns from the visitors that I spoke to and the businesses and organizations, combined with literature to back up my recommendations, and that's how I came up with these. So my first recommendation was to openly discuss and share what the fees are being used for. My second one was to keep some camping free. My third recommendation is to think about equity. And the last recommendation is to work with locals and visitors to create an innovative fee system. So the first three are probably pretty logical based on what I've talked about so far. This last one, I spoke to quite a few people that had really interesting ideas that were more than just a standard $20 a night fee. And I think that if the BLM has like an open dialogue with their visitors, they could maybe come up with some really cool system that's very place specific and will therefore be more accepted by its visitors. So as with any project, there are challenges and limitations. So like I mentioned a few times, the weather in DENCA was a challenge in itself. It got really hot, and so I had to be adaptable and kind of change up my project a little bit. Another challenge to me was surveying alone. And while I'm very good at talking to people and approaching people, I was a woman alone in a place where there was no service. So I had to be very cognizant of my safety There were some situations where I was like, oh, I could go interview that person. I got a weird vibe, I just didn't walk up to them. So I could have potentially gotten more people, but I wanted to put my safety first. I've mentioned a few times my small sample size. This is a limitation just in being able to generalize these findings. And then I had to omit some demographic questions that I thought would have been interesting to know. Because I was trying to keep the survey and the interview really short, I had to pick my highest priority questions to ask. But I do wish I could have asked people's age and how often they visit DENCA. I think that would have been really beneficial in knowing, like, oh, maybe if they visit more often, they're more willing to pay higher prices or something like that. And then the last challenge and limitation was that because of the informality of these interviews, I did not record any of them. I only took notes. And as with anything, there's room for human error there. I could have misunderstood and written the wrong thing, or maybe even misinterpreted my notes later on when I was inputting data. So that's just kind of a natural process of the human condition. All right, so my self-reflection. I had a lot of fun with this project. I am a pretty extroverted person, so going up, talking to strangers is what I'm good at. I really enjoyed just going up to people and asking if they had a minute to talk, and it felt even better when they all said yes. So that was really fun, just to get to talk to people and get to know a little bit more about them and their perceptions of this issue. And then, like I've mentioned, I've been working on my flexibility and adaptability. I think we all know that by now. So when I was developing this project with my partners, I had a pretty hard time in knowing that it was okay to not know what I was doing. I struggled with the details. I was like, but how do I know where I'm going to live and all these things? But it's like, just have to be flexible with it. And once I had all those things down, I feel like I was able to really lean into the fact that things change and I will have to be flexible. Even when I was in DENCA and I was interviewing people, if there was no one else at the boat launch, I would be like, okay, I'm driving to the campground, or I'm gonna go find some people who are in the dispersed camping. So I just kind of had to be really flexible with finding people and things like that. I got to work on my unbiased facilitation. So some people were very, very passionate about this subject in the positive or the negative. And so I did my best to just listen, ask probing questions, and not give my opinion in any way. And then finally, I got to practice skills that we learned in CLTL. So I got to practice my interview skills and data analysis. I was excited when I got to use SPSS again. I think it's really fun. So I feel much more proficient in those things now. I'm really excited for the future. And just before I wrap up, I want to give a special thank you to the CLTL professors, for Dawson specifically, for letting me vent on Zoom calls throughout the summer. I want to thank my partners at the BLM for being there, answering any questions that I had. I want to thank my partner, Andrew, who told me this morning he could give this presentation at this point. My parents, who are hopefully still on that Zoom call, and then the best cohort ever. Any questions?